Welcome to Molding Masculinity. I'm Tom McFarland, once again here with Philip Sipe, and today we're going to talk about safety or lack of safety in kind of masculine spaces. I think we have a lot of personal stories to share on this one. We're recording this one a day later than normal, well, 2 days later actually than normal because of my own forays into this particular matter. But in short, we're talking about how masculine presenting people avoid, deny, or otherwise ignore safety precautions. Am I right, Philip?
Yeah, I've taken to in my own head because I'm a lover of fantasy and mythology, calling this the sort of Achilles phenomenon. Uh, the idea that you're invincible to everything up until the point that it hits you and exposes your weakness, and then at that point you're allowed to say, oh, I have this and I have to take safety precautions as a result. But you have to get hurt by it. Not that it does, the analogy breaks down very quickly with the story of Achilles specifically, because obviously when he finally got hit in his weak point, he died because it was a poison arrow. But, no analogy is perfect. And I like having a name for it because otherwise we end up taking like 5 sentences to explain this weird cultural phenomenon that in my experience in talking with other guys about it, pretty much everyone, the minute you describe it, goes like, "Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean."
Yeah, and I think the calling it the
Achilles, yeah.
Achilles, the Achilles phenomenon. I'm gonna mispronounce that like 6 more times.
It's fine.
I think emphasizes a point of this that is kind of common that I hadn't really even thought about until you first described this to me, and that is, yeah, the once you experience the thing, then you'll like never shut up about that safety precaution, and I've definitely experienced that. Like, and it's something that I think you encounter. At least I encounter a lot with older men, who are who are aggressively safe about certain things and will talk your absolute ear off about how, like, well, one time I saw somebody not wearing their helmet and this is what happened, and one time I did this and this is what happened. And as I get older, I catch myself doing the same thing too. And I mean, and part of that is like a normal human. It's just how we work. Like, we see a dangerous thing, we see an accident happen, and like, and our brain records that, and we remember it and bring it up every time we encounter that situation again, and that's like a survival mechanism. It makes sense. But also, we're intelligent human beings, and we're capable of understanding that those situations are possible of existing before they exist. And it seems like more feminine presenting folks and women have an easier time doing that than men, masculine presenting folks, often do. Uh,
Yeah, for sure. And it's weird exactly for what you said. It's like one of the strengths of human intelligence is that we have the ability to model things and understand processes and have like so the ability to do, say, like a scientific approach to things and understand uh you know um when someone tells you don't touch this really colorful frog, it's poisonous, you will die if you touch it. You can be like, all right, well, this you can go look it up if you're extra skeptical, but ultimately you learn like, yeah, poison dart frogs excrete this poison, you shouldn't touch them, you'll die. um and I don't need to touch a poison dart frog and have to go to the hospital and nearly die to prove that to permission not to touch a poison dart frog. But for some reason there are certain areas, particularly in areas around like labor, in which unless you have a story about seeing someone's hand getting ground up in a machine or something, safety precautions are optional. You have to have a horror story to not get teased or made to feel insufficiently masculine for not wanting to put your one and only body at permanent risk of injury, or risk of permanent injury. I mean, um,
yeah. And I feel like this often, even, and of course, the most immediate, you know, form of this is things like you're talking about, like immediate bodily injury. But we also do it in other elements of, and I think this is like leads us to what kind of feeds into a lot of this is things that are mitigating just simple displeasure, like unpleasurable experiences. Like my wife, I mentioned this to my wife the other day that we were going to do this topic, and she brought up, "Hey, I remember when we first started dating, and you told me that you don't have an umbrella and never have had an umbrella because you're not afraid to get wet. Like, what? I'm a man. I can handle being damp from rain." And how goofy that was. And it's like, yep, I definitely did that. Uh,
Yeah, it manifests in a lot of small things. Like I feel like the most common ones, like not willing to put like a band-aid on to a small cut or something like that. Like, I don't need a band-aid. I'm tough. Um,
just give me a bottle of vodka and a stick to bite on.
yeah, it's like, okay, well, okay, I'm glad, Stephen, that you're super tough and that you don't need a band-aid for your cut, but also like infections are real. don't don't get your finger cut off because you wanted to prove that you could, still operate a buzz saw with a cut on your finger or something. It's just, yeah. So it's a weird phenomenon. It's one that I think has a lot of consequences, and I'm looking forward to sort of exploring that today.
Yeah, and so before all of these episodes, we tried to do a lot of research, or at least you tried to do a lot of research and diving into these topics. And this one was a particularly difficult one to do that. At least I found on my end. I found a few studies. I have at least one study. I need to dig that up and see if I can't post that on the Facebook group, and a TED talk that I'll definitely share here later on our Facebook page or Facebook group. But this is a one like part of what it makes this a little bit harder to study in my experience out there is that the idea of safety is extremely clouded in companies that specialize in selling safety to labor institutions. Because I mean that's where like a lot of this comes into play is in labor, like and especially when you start discussing safety, specifically when you start discussing safety in the workplace, a lot of focus gets put on work, on OSHA related things. So on construction sites, on in factories, in those kind of spaces is really where everybody is talking about safety, and it's never from really scientific organizations talking about this. It's usually places that are selling certain safety programs to companies, and that made it a really muddy river to kind of try to get through to find really good and like really solid science on the matter in my experience.
Yeah, I had a very similar struggle in that, like, sort of my approach for a lot of these topics has been like, I'll first like kind of, ping uh, some male friends and being like, hey, do you experience this? Like, what's kind of your, like, try to get some sort of like anecdotal sense of like, is this something that, is just my individual experience, or is this something that's like broadly experienced by the male population? Uh, uh, just getting an intuitive sense of it, and then like once I kind of have uh, some some broader understanding from anecdotes of like how some of these things have manifested in people's lives, I'll use that to sort of focus and look at studies and find things. um, and it was just super weird in that like every single person I talked to about it was like, I 100% know what you mean. I have at least 3 or 4 stories about how exactly this thing has manifested in my life. Um, 3 or 4 big stories, along with a handful of like minor experiences, like not wanting to wear Band-Aid or whatever. Uh, and every single person I talked to was like, yeah, exactly. That's definitely a thing. And then just maybe my Google foo here was weak. But man, it is just impossible to find any like scientific analysis of any kind on this sort of thing. I think it's largely, I mean, it's probably a combination of the fact that it's a difficult thing to measure. Like, someone doesn't comply with safety thing. Well, they were reckless. Well, reckless for what reason? Like, is not something that um, is easy to explore, and involves a lot of like if you were to even try to do it, there's like a lot of like fuzzy self-reporting that would have to go on that would make it, call into question the solidity of the and replicatability of the data. Like, anyway, so I say I get the impression that a lot that this is just a thing that's really difficult to study, but I think we all kind of know that it's a thing that men struggle with, and um, in particular around areas where work and labor is involved. Um, because I have yet to talk to anyone uh, that doesn't immediately know what I'm discussing, even though there's no name for it. I have to sit here and describe, like, the kind of carve out in conceptual space, the idea I'm trying to capture here. And then once I kind of like finish my description, the fact that every single guy I've talked to has been like, "Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. That's 100% a thing," and seems to understand immediately. It suggests to me that there's something real here. I think it's largely at the cultural level. I don't think that it's something that is maybe even studyable in a very direct scientific way. It's sort of very specifically a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, as we both alluded to, it feeds into so many issues in labor and the workplace. And, and one of the things that we've really seen lately where this has been kind of taking place on the more mainstream platform of things going on in our world has been with labor disputes, with the union strike in Topeka for the Frito Lay Company, the union strike in Alabama with miners who are right now they're actually striking in New York City and Manhattan for coal workers in Alabama because that's where like the factory or where the like company that owns the factory is located. But and so along with tied into those, you have workers who are working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, or 16-hour days, 7 days a week, striking or protesting about their working conditions, and you'll have a lot of conversation online and elsewhere about how, well, I work 100 hours a week, and if you don't work 100 hours a week, you need to just sit down and be quiet because real men work all the time of the day. And it becomes like this, like, as we've mentioned before, I think we mentioned it was something else, like having an Olympics of you know bad things happening to you. But this is, again, it's very much like, it becomes an Olympic sport of who can be exploited the most because that's the most masculine thing to do. And that's like all of this, and this is why when we talk about, and something else I want to kind of blip onto all of this, is that when we talk about toxic masculinity, we're not just like, that's not just a buzzword. We're using it we're describing maladaptive behaviors, things that we do that we tie to masculinity that actively damage us in the long run. And this is a prime example of one. Working 100 hours a week because it's the masculine thing to do damages us in the long run. Not wearing a respirator on a factory floor when you're working with chemicals because I'm I'm tough because it's the masculine thing to do actively damages us in the long run. That is active toxic masculinity. It's damaging to your existence to do it, and there's no reason to do it.
Yeah, toxic masculinity as a phrase, I feel like has been um, very misunderstood, and I think often intentionally misrepresented by people that either want to cast it as just like social justice buzzword, or I think in some cases organizations that are actively profiting or benefiting from people having this attitude that are not are one to misrepresent it to make it a thing to ignore that really focuses on the masculinity part of that phrase and wants to make it seem like oh, you know, anyone who's against toxic masculinity is against masculinity itself, as if like they want to make it as if like what we're saying is masculinity is toxic instead of that there are toxic parts of masculinity that cause harm to men. And you know, that is what toxic masculinity actually is. It's evaluating what are the things that we think are like make someone a real man that are actually like suck, that are hurtful or damaging to us. And I think this is a great example of that, of like this idea that like you know, uh you know, we should just like completely sacrifice ourselves to get the job done in a sort of like all capital letters sort of um, sense, sort of get the job done, a trademark. But like, I think there's, you know, I think evaluating who benefits from that actually, because it often really hurts the people that do it. And who benefits from that? It's the people that own that own the value of that labor and the additional performance that one gets. Like, I don't want to throw all self-sacrificial behavior out the window. Like, not this is not a baby with the bathwater thing. Obviously, there's a great nobility to, you know, sacrificing one's own well-being for the benefit, for the greater benefit of others. But I think that gets pathologized a lot of times in cases where it's really just someone who wants you to work overtime or wants you to work harder or more dangerously so that performance numbers goes up in a way that doesn't benefit the people doing it. It doesn't benefit a larger group of people either. It benefits a smaller group of people in a very particular and monetizable way that, you know, the people that benefit from a bunch of men going around being like, I don't got to be safe, I just got to get this job done fast, you know, are not the people doing the job. They get paid the same regardless. It's the people that own the output of that business.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, in this kind of, through line through current events continues into our big giant umbrella of a current event of COVID. Um, so much of, in my own workplace, so much of mask wearing, resistance to mask wearing has been a male bravado attitude of, well, I'm not going to wear a mask. I don't need a little piece of cloth over me. I know that I'm healthy and I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. Those being the key phrase there. I'm not afraid. And I mean, and it one of the fascinating things too that I observe with all, well, now before I get too far down the rabbit hole in this, I want to say that this is also, I think, very much a through line that exists through a lot of resistance to vaccination. Well, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I'm tough and I can handle this with my own natural body, ignoring the fact that we've all had vaccinations ever since we were a kid, and that's why we don't have polio and smallpox and all kinds of, rickets and horrifying diseases that, used to just decimate our childhood population. But so an interesting element to this that I see is that we often have this resistance to safety issues, to anything that protects us from something that isn't considered a violent threat, I think is the way I would like to phrase this. So by this, what I mean is the same folks in my community and the same, and I very much mean this in my community. I'm not talking about like others. These are, friends and family and people I care about. The same resistance that I see this attitude against, well, I'm not going to wear a mask because I'm not afraid. You'll see this attitude of, but I carry a 380 on me all the time. I wear, I know a guy who wears actual chain, like a chainmail vest underneath his shirt. Of like, well, yeah, if I ever get stabbed, this like will stop the blade. And it's like, okay, the likelihood that on the way to the gas station in your nice, comfortable suburb, you're going to get stabbed in the chest and have to shoot somebody is minusculely low. And I say this as a firearm, as somebody who practices, like I have a whole other podcast called Handy with Handguns where I talk about firearm safety and the use and carrying of firearms. I advocate for the carrying of firearms. But when we're talking about safety, we often have this hyperfixation on being super okay with certain kinds of obsessive safety paired with, I'm not going to wear safety goggles or like safety glasses when I weed eat because I'm too masculine for that. And it is way more likely that you're going to be weed eating your yard tomorrow and you're going to hit a rock and it's going to scratch your cornea than somebody is going to run up to you at a Kmart and stab you with a pocket knife. Like, one of those things is way more common than the other. And when we look in workplace scenarios, we see this same thing play out. Police, we are real quick to give every single police officer full body armor, but we're not as quick to institute masking and vaccinations in public schools.
Yeah, I think in general, we have this idea of human violence in particular that is weighted as more serious and B, more common than it actually is. For example, I think obviously like police as an institution are under a lot of discussion in the wake of the whole George Floyd thing and everything. But like setting aside, the larger conversation about police in general that's happening, like one thing that has always annoyed me about the conversation is this sort of almost romantic dedication to, the romantic idea of police, of how like they stand between us and the violent criminals and their job is so dangerous. And like obviously being in a firefight with, drug lords or whatever is dangerous, and that deserves a degree of respect for people that do fight against those things. But at the same time, it's also not the common experience of a police officer. If you look at the data of police, you're going to find that a lot of very common jobs are significantly more dangerous than police as far as like where injuries and fatalities come into play. Measurably, police officer is not as dangerous a job as say like a construction worker. Um, and I don't want to get into the like, I don't want to get into like an oppression Olympics type of competition of who has the most dangerous job. Like that's the toxic masculinity thing we're trying to fight against. But like I do think like it sheds a light, like even at a national level, we have this like disconnect in the romantic idea of what things are dangerous and deserve attention and respect and safety, and what things are, just the kind of thing you got to be tough about. That is completely disconnected from the actual data underlying those things. We often take safety precautions against things that are warranted and should have those safety precautions taken, that are far less likely and far less common than things that we often just like go like, whatever, like be tough, you got to take it. And it's like, well, that's not, taking a very sort of data and facts sort of analysis to it really shows that like there's a lot of like weird disconnects in all kinds of places of things that like we just completely ignore at a cultural level of that are significantly more dangerous than like terrorism, for example, like which gets has gotten a ton of attention since 2001, despite the fact that like there's like infinite things that are like way more common and way more deadly than terrorists. But they don't scratch that romantic itch of imagining a great enemy to fight against or anything like that. That it's like it's always frustrating to me as someone who likes to try to approach things from a data perspective. It's just oftentimes like people are arguing from the point of view of like, I have this story in my head of how these things exist and play out that like is just not real. It's not connected to reality in any way.
Yeah, and I think all of this brings us to an important element of where I would argue, and I'm arguing this again without a lot of great studies or research to really back me up, because as we've already talked about, so this is kind of an intuitive, opinion based stance that I have to take on this. But where I kind of feel like a lot of this comes from is from media, from movies, from film, from well, primarily movies and film, if we're going to be honest here. And it's something that is so endemic that, like, so I went through media school. There's two elements of this I want to talk about. I went through media school, and in the time when I was in media school, I had two of my professors or instructors, however you will, who were very frustrated by how every single student, and played out inside the industry, almost every writer and director wants to focus all issues of conflict on violence. It's just how we think of conflict most often. You know, it's like every movie, the primary conflict, the primary thing that causes anybody damage or in any way is harmful or scary is violent conflict from another human being. It's that same thing of it has to be a terrorist. It has to be something big and scary that is a universal threat. It can never be small things. No, none of our superhero or, superheroes or regular heroes or individuals at all in media are ever threatened, harmed, or in risk of danger from, a grinder or a weed eater or improper use, not having PPE while they're working with chemicals. Like all of that stuff isn't relevant in our media, and in fact is often aggressively, you see a lot of media where like they aggressively make a big point about like, no, I'm tough, so I don't have to do that. And I think that plays an element of it. Now, I want to talk about this also from a different direction, and this is kind of using something else as an example of when I was studying in China for my undergraduate degree. So, my undergraduate minor is in Chinese language, and I spent some time in China studying that. And I encountered a lot of racism that existed in China. There was a friend that I used to hang out with, and she was black, and it happened a lot that people would be explicitly racist towards her. Like we would go into stores and people would like follow her. Like, well, so okay, I'm using this as an example, so I'm going to use the whole example here. We went into a store, and the person who ran the store was following her the whole way through the store. And between us, between the little bit of Mandarin that we both knew, we kind of confronted her and asked her, like, "Hey, what's up?" And she's like, "Well, I'm making sure you don't steal anything." Like, why would you think that I would steal anything? Well, because you're black. Like, have you? And then like I asked her, like, have you ever met a black person? She's like, nope, never seen a black person before in my life. Why do you think that she would steal? Well, because that's what you see in the movies. And this stretched to later on when so, of course, this was like a wild experience for, for her especially. Afterwards, we were asking other Chinese friends of ours, like, hey, what the fuck was this about? Like, this kind of experience that, it exists here. What is this about? And a lot of people replicating, like, well, yeah, no, that's what you see in movies. All the black people in American movies are criminals. And we often argue here in the States as to whether or not representation matters in film and cinema. And so that is my way of saying, like, I've seen it from firsthand experience in a country where that is extremely homogenous and doesn't have other experience, that yes, it very much affects culture. And so I think in this other very different scenario, I think it does affect our culture to a degree that we don't have variety of conflict in our media and television. This isn't me saying that we need to turn all of our movies into workplace safety seminars, like not at all, but it's just, it's a fact. I don't know, the way that we approach this topic in our culture feeds into how we approach it in media, which then continues to feed how we approach it in culture.
Yeah, it's I really feel you in the sense that like we have like that a lot of this is media fueled. This has been this has come to mind and for me and recently, and at the time we're recording this, the summer Olympics are ongoing, and I was watching fencing, uh, the fencing competition, and it struck me how um, boring. And I say that with I enjoyed it. I didn't think it was boring to watch. What I mean is like compared to the romantic way that sword fighting is displayed in movies and stuff, where people are like doing all these like cool like spins and like all these awesome looking moves or whatever. How like I guess like mundane is probably the better word. How mundane everything was. And
Yes. And now I'm going to be jumping on this because I have a background in fencing too, but yeah, you're right. You're right because economy of motion is super important in fencing, and so it is real life sword fighting doesn't look absolutely anything like what you see in movies.
yeah, and so like that like it occurred to me, it's like, oh, it's like this flash of activity, and then like if they weren't wearing, if they weren't playing a sport, if they were actually sword fighting, it'd be like a few seconds and like, whoops, there's a hole in your shoulder. Like, and you just do that 5 or 6 times and someone's, badly injured enough and debilitated enough that they're probably gonna die or at least lose every other exchange. Like um and how and I've seen this a lot in like my sons both take martial arts, they take taekwondo, and there's a very big difference between taekwondo forms and motions and stuff like that, where they're doing like that are very artistic sort of thing, and taekwondo sparring, which is way more like uh you know one strike there, a lot of positioning, a lot of like it's so much more mundane than all the sort of romantic ideas of all this stuff. um and I feel like that's part of the problem, is that like we have a lot of stories about what dangerous things look like and what um, safety and defense and protection looks like, that is just not realistic. The reality of the situation is that like um, really being safe, really being ready to defend yourself and doing it is so much more mundane uh, than the romantic ideas that we have in movies. And I understand why the movies don't do it, because I mean it's boring. Like it's not cool to watch, like a fantasy battle where someone like comes up and like just jabs someone a little bit in like a vital point, and that person's like doubles over in pain and then just gets kind of like boringly executed or something like that. Like it's much more cool to see them like jump down from a roof and like slice the guy's head off or whatever. Like there's like what makes a good, like the thing that you have to keep in mind is like what makes a good story and what makes good life advice are very different things. And that like narratives are ways that we express ourselves, and they are ways that we can help us to understand very complex things that are difficult to express. Like for example, a lot of like broad society descriptions that you get into, ideologies and stuff like that, they have narratives about the way that things work, and those narratives help bring down a very complicated thing to an understandable level. You put it in sort of a story like form about how things play out, and it lets you kind of see it through a certain lens. But you always have to imagine and remember that that is a lens. It's not a capturing of reality. And certainly Hollywood movies are not a capturing of reality, particularly when it comes to what things are dangerous, what safety looks like, what being a man looks like. Like these are not things that you should be taking from movies, because they are there to construct an entertaining story. They are not there to be guides for intelligent, well-informed living. And if you are making your decisions about like how to be a man based on romantic ideas that you've gotten from books and movies, you're probably going to find that that clashes with reality in some very important ways.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, um, Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think I want to kind of shift gears here because we've hit on that a few times, and I think you are 100% right. This we have this division of reality, fact and fiction, and reality that happens along a lot of subjects, especially encompassing masculinity. This is something I talk about a lot on my other podcast. The fact that a lot of folks really get this like really functioning attitude of how reality works regarding firearms from movies that is absolutely wrong because nobody really involved in filmmaking knows much about firearms, so they don't get things right. But moving from that, some of the little bit of data and studies that I did find on this subject. So in talking about, so we have a good idea of what causes this um, view of the world, what causes this issue, and we understand what this issue is. So let's talk about a bit about how to solve that. And we've talked a little bit about that and reckoning what reality and fiction is. But also something that came up a lot in these in the little bit of discussions I could find on this subject was that what often hurts companies when companies are trying to do this is the fact that safety rules and regulations often come off as arbitrary and as bureaucracy. And I think, and of course, this is like advice that is explicitly tailored and intended for businesses and companies and factory owners. And that's part of why I didn't want to dive into a lot of what I had actually found in like papers on this. But I do think that that's something that's applicable to people's real life, in such as to say, learn about the things that you want to do or that you do. Learn about things, study about things, and in the process of doing so, don't like don't make those arbitrary rules to yourself. Don't there's no we live in a world of information and there's no reason to live in a world of arbitrary rules. Like I am 100% about that. I loathe arbitrary rules. It's part of what causes me to seek out knowledge about specific things is because I hate when things are arbitrary. Don't do that just because. No, I don't want to know why I have to why I don't want to know why I should use the grinder on one specific side of the grinder and not on the other side. Like I don't want to do that without knowing why. It just bugs me. I don't want an arbitrary reason as to why I have to do it. But we live in a world of information. You can go look at the manufacturer's website on reasons, but that's kind of boring and lame. Go onto YouTube, find people who are welders and grinders who are very accustomed to doing this, who will very explicitly tell you why, and then give you some awesome demonstrations of a grinder like shredding through pants and a like hawk of bologna and ham to show you just how much why you shouldn't do it that way. Like it's cutting through the rule or like cutting through the arbitrariness of safety rules involves a lot of self-education, and there's like that's one of the great benefits of living in the era and time that we do is that there is a massive amount of available self-education. So I guess in saying this is like learn about the things that you do and learn about your job and don't be afraid of things. Like I kind of have, this is kind of came up in this episode. I have a bit of a reputation of being a sort of jack of all trades. I literally have like a ship's wheel tattooed over my heart. This is a very real thing.
Oh,
That
wow. I actually didn't know that.
and that is like a symbolic thing for me of the idea of the like I control my own path and destiny, and that like that tattoo is my way of like telling myself that I am, I guess, a sort of jack of all trades. That I want to don't be afraid to change directions and be something new at any time in any place. But anyways, so I am about that. I'm about that idea of like, go out there and learn how to weld tomorrow. And then after you're done with that, you decide you want to learn how to make cabinets, go do that. After that, you decide you want to learn how to program, go do it. Like, seek the things out. We live only one life, and it is an amazing opportunity to be, if you have the privilege to seek these kind of things and this kind of knowledge out. But in doing so, don't, dive into it without taking the time to learn why certain safety should be put in place, and then not, like it's not emasculating to be knowledgeable and to take precautions.
Yeah, and you should definitely know when exploring new things to avoid uh, uh, there's a famous psychological phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is explains this phenomenon where people who are very, very well educated in a field express a lot more self doubt and hesitancy to claim confident knowledge than people who are more poorly educated. Um, and a lot of times, like just getting into something gets you right at the peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where like you feel like you know just about everything and you're ready to tell everyone how it works, and you know enough to start having some questions about why you do things a certain way. And you should always keep in mind that like you don't want to be at the peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's the most dangerous place to be, because it's the place where people go like, I know what I'm doing here. I don't gotta do this. This is unnecessary. And then they like lose their hand or something. It's have some amount of self-skepticism to always like know, I don't know everything. It's okay. Like if I don't know why I need to do something and people who are my teachers said this is absolutely necessary, you better do that thing up until the point that you at least learn the rationale behind it and know enough to know that that's something that you can shortcut if in fact you can, because it's easy to start thinking that you're invincible and nothing bad's going to happen to you because you know what you're doing, uh, and it's kind of wrapped up in that same sort of phenomenon of thinking that nothing bad is going to happen to you and you don't got to take precautions, type of thing.
Yeah, I agree. Even though that you've kind of you tapered what I said, but I think in a very valuable and very accurate way. Yeah, like and the Dunning Kruger effect is something I myself stumble into a lot. And yeah, you're 100% right. Have the introspection to realize that you don't know everything, especially as you're seeking out more and more things to know. That generally, like I'll say this from my own experience, the more things I learn, the less I kind of know everything super in depth, because we are a limited reservoir of information. Like we all only
Mhm.
know so much. Like, um, yeah, yeah,
And we're going to get into this in the parenting reflection, but it's worth mentioning here that, man, does this stand out to you when you have children, on all the ways in which like you have failed to examine some of the stuff, like particularly around like say like the toughness thing. um Man, it's I still don't know if I'm doing it right. I still have no idea if like I'm striking the right balance here of, like I don't want to encourage my son to engage in the same sort of toxic masculinity of like I can just not wear band-aid, or I can just tough it out type of stuff. But at the same time, like you don't need to be an adult that cries when they bump their knee into a table. Like there is a value to being able to endure certain discomfort and certain pain, but at the same time, man, like figuring out how to teach that to someone when you know very well that like your perception of it all is skewed and informed by stupid narratives from movies or whatever, is just like it's hard to sort out in my own mind, and to know like like every single time I am correcting my kid saying like, okay, this isn't really something you need to cry over, like there's a voice in the back of my head that's like, am I teaching my son to that it's not okay to cry? I tried to counteract that with an explicit narrative saying like it's fine to be upset, it's fine to cry and express yourself, but you know you need some perspective on when things are worth that level of emotional upsetness, type of thing. But man, it's a rough one to navigate.
I can imagine, and I know this is definitely something I've. And I should avoid diving too much into this and save a lot of this more for the fatherhood episode, but I'll preface in saying that I feel like I've encountered some of this in mentoring kids, and yeah, running into the same thing of like, how do I want to teach them to toughen up and to be able to deal with, like, especially with like bullying when it comes into like, there's this really hard rift there with bullying of where on one hand, I want you to understand that yes, people are going to say mean things to you in life, and you have to not take every ounce of it to heart. Also, though, we have to take this a little bit, we also need to, that isn't to excuse what the other person has said, and that isn't to say that you need to just be steamrolled over. Like, I don't know, it's a constant, every single time it comes up, it's like, wow, it's hard to deal with, especially, I would say, not having the experience yet for fully dealing with it.
Oh yeah. Well, and like with I've mentioned before, and like with everything in dealing with mentorship or parenting, particularly um, with younger children, you're always fighting the uphill battle of having to teach them something simple and wrong, and then later go back and correct that. And um, you know, there are times when I'm just like, it's just so hard. I think that like my default is generally like um, to say like, if you're going to cry, I want to some like it should be something that someone would be concerned about. Like I generally say like something like we're really hurt. Like in that sense, like there should be blood or there should be obvious injury or like, but like at the same time it's like that's also like so fuzzy, and I can definitely like see how that could be taken to a point where it's like oh yeah, so unless you like break your leg, don't come crying to me about your like that like, but it's so hard not to come off that way when your kid bonks their knee for like the third time in a day, and it's really just like that they're okay, that they're not really hurt, and you're just tired of them being reckless with themselves, and you're just like wanting to stop hearing the screams of children. uh it's hard to keep that consistency going. I mean, that's just the struggle of parenting in general,
there's
which obviously we'll get into. I don't want to get too deep into this well, but
there's always the terrible option that I think this is the last thing I have to share today, but the terrible option that my grandpa, my papa, grandpa, and my uh, mother's side, when I was very little, I was doing the same thing. I was, getting lightly injured and then bawling like crazy about it, and I had like a bruise on one arm where I like bumped into the table, and I was just going on ad nauseum about it. And he was like, "Well, that when you get a bruise, that means you broke a bone, right?" Just stone cold tells me that every time you get a bruise, that means you broke a bone. And that locked into my head, and I swear I was probably a preteen before I understood that having a bruise did not mean that I did not have a broken bone.
oh wow. Yeah, that is not the model I would recommend
No,
personally.
no, not at all.
Especially not if you have a child like mine. My oldest is very information absorbent and very sensitive, and will like he would absolutely lose his shit if I told him that. Uh, he would start freaking out, and I don't think he would believe me at this point. I think he's old enough to go, that's not true. Um, but man, yeah, that not what I would recommend.
Do you have anything else to share this week? I think that kind of taps me out.
Yeah. Uh, about the only thing I can think of is like my own personal experience with this was um having, like I think everyone's kind of got their own story, and for mine it was like um as a kid, I remember getting made fun of a lot for wearing my helmet. Um, implications that like, I'm not tough or cool enough to be one of the big kids wearing their helmet. Uh, and up until the point that I fell down and smacked my head on a curb while wearing a helmet, my helmet split in half. At which point, that story was good enough to get me excused for helmet wearing. Uh, and I think that is very indicative of the phenomenon we're talking about here. Of like, that could have been my skull if I had succumbed to that as a child. So I don't, it's easy to take these kind of stories and say like, oh, these are little things about people trying to, be, macho or whatever. And you know, putting out a lot of bravado or whatever. But like this is not consequenceless like thing. Like people die because of a lack of taking themselves and their bodies seriously and safety precautions seriously. So, I would just say anyone who's, you know, in one of those scenarios where maybe you're experiencing some social repercussions for wanting to take your safety seriously, um, don't get yourself killed because you want to appear you know masculine or whatever. um, it's not worth it. It's just not worth dying to prove that you're a real man. Real men live.
Yeah, it's easy it's easy to die. It is harder to live. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. Like, don't risk yourself for the sake of looking cool when, yeah, like, you only get one life. And honestly, in a lot of cases too, we focus so much on the death portion of things, but I can say, and I'm not going to dive too deep into this because this isn't a thing I like to dive too deep into, but I've seen a lot of instances in life of things that were much worse than death, ways of living, from taking unnecessary risks where you're trapped in a terrible state for the rest of your life. There's a lot of things worse than death out there. So yeah, take care of yourself, and do that over the feelings of others. Like, if people want to put you down because you care about your body and existence, like, that's
Get new
unreasonable.
friends.
Yeah, get new friends.
Those people aren't your friends.
Yeah. Uh, well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, morning, evening, or whatever time of it is. Wear your seatbelt, wear a mask if necessary, get vaccinated. For the love of God, get vaccinated. Thank you all.